Linda, as I tease her, and Dick for that matter, are very persistent. As you might imagine, I get a lot of speaking invitations. We all get a lot of speaking invitations these days. And I'm always reluctant because it's a lot of travel. It's a lot of work in Washington, and travel on top of it just gets me even further behind. But Linda was, again, very persistent and convinced me to come here. And as is not usual, a lot of times I get traveling and I'm thinking, why am I here? This is just the opposite. I am so happy that I am here and have been able to participate in this conference. And sorry, I have to leave shortly after lunch. But you all truly have been an inspiration, and you know, in Washington it sometimes gets very frustrating, even when you're finally in a position where you can do something. It gets very frustrating and sometimes even discouraging. And again, it's often exhausting as well, but it's conferences like this and listening to all of you that really give me a lot of inspiration and really more energy to go back and do the work that needs to be done. So again, I want to thank you for inviting me. And I want to also thank Linda for coming to Washington, taking some time to come to Washington to participate in OSHA Listens a few weeks ago. That was Dr. Michael's effort to really listen to what people need, what people want from OSHA. And we had a lot of workers there, a lot of activists, a lot of family members who had lost loved ones in workplace accidents and from workplace disease. And Linda was a real major contribution to that effort. I want to tell you, you do have friends in OSHA, even aside from me. I've been there about a year now. In fact, I think my anniversary is next week. I was asked to come in and kind of be acting assistant secretary until we had a confirmed assistant secretary. And I want to say something about our Secretary of Labor, Hilda Solis. I've been in Washington a long time, and it's rare, almost non-existent, that you'll have a cabinet secretary like Hilda Solis who is so supportive of workplace safety issues and worker issues in general. When I got there, I sat down with her and I said, you know, I'm here for probably many months before we have an assistant secretary. What do you want? And she very clearly said, what I don't want is just a caretaker here. I want to get started on my agenda, and I want you to get started on it. And never once did I feel like, because I was acting assistant secretary, that there was anything we couldn't do there. We got started right away on that agenda. And I can't tell you how much admiration I have for her and for her real feelings and understanding of what workers go through every day. About 4 months ago, Dr. David Michaels was confirmed by the Senate and became our Assistant Secretary. David and I have been, I think many of you know him, he and I have been friends for many years. He ran the Health and Safety Program at the Department of Energy during the last term of the Clinton administration, very knowledgeable about these issues, and particularly knowledgeable. I don't know how many of you have read his book called Doubt is Our Product, but it actually dealt with a number of, especially chemical-related issues, and how the corporate community has really manipulated the evidence and continues to try to manipulate the evidence that, you know, to really reduce protections for workers, and that's something that you know, we're all very aware of, and something we are determined to fight back against in this administration. Now, these have been very difficult weeks in occupational safety and health, months. It's always difficult in occupational safety and health. It wasn't so long ago on a very snowy Super Bowl Sunday that we learned that 6 workers had been killed at a clean energy site, a clean energy power plant that was under construction in Connecticut, and a massive explosion there. I just went and visited the site a few weeks ago. It was just a little over a week ago that 5 workers were killed at a Tesoro refinery in an explosion in Anacortes, Washington. And of course, we're all very saddened at the 29 brave miners who were lost in the Upper Big Branch explosion this week. Now, as you all know, though, more than these incidents made a lot of headlines, but there are more than 5,000 people killed in the workplace every year from workplace incidents, from traumatic incidents, from explosions and getting caught in machines and things like that. And that doesn't even begin to touch on the tens of thousands who die every year from work-related disease, including the thousands that die of asbestos-related disease every year. None of these workers, of course, get the headlines that others have gotten. They mostly die one at a time, unnoted, unremembered, except by their families, friends, and their coworkers. In the case of workplace disease, which often takes their lives many years after they leave the workplace, many of their coworkers don't even know. So what we're dealing with here is not just a crisis in the mines, a crisis with MSHA. We're dealing with an occupational safety and health crisis. Things have gotten better, certainly over the last 40 years since MSHA and OSHA were created, but it's still inexcusable that we lose that many workers every year in this country. And one thing we are going to be trying to do now in Washington, obviously there's been a lot of talk about how to make our mines safer. We are going to try to broaden that discussion, and we need your help to broaden that discussion into making our workplaces safer. And as we go to Congress, as you know, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but there is legislation in Congress right now to try to make a number of improvements in the Occupational Safety and Health Act. There was a bill introduced last year, passed in the House, to make further improvements in the Mine Safety and Health Act. Again, what we need to do is view this as a general workplace safety and health crisis in this country, something that we really need to deal with holistically in the Congress and in the administration. Now, let me get to the subject of this meeting. I understand, I know, and I sympathize, and I certainly agree with your main goal, which is banning asbestos in this country. Now, unfortunately, as a representative of OSHA, I have to sound like a bureaucrat because OSHA, unfortunately, has no authority to ban anything pretty much in this country. What we have to do is just make sure that workers are safe. And as you all know, and as we hear constantly, even if you did ban asbestos in this country tomorrow, there's still an enormous hazard out there for everyone working in the many industries and the many professions that still encounter asbestos. Obviously maintaining, renovating, demolishing buildings, still repairing older ships, brakes in automobiles, a number of issues that have been brought up already in this conference. Now, OSHA's been active in in asbestos control for many, many years, almost since the beginning of the agency. We've addressed several times and improved on our permissible exposure limits and our OSHA standards. And we have a number of requirements in terms of how to remove asbestos safely, how to work with asbestos safely. We have permissible exposure limits, but I think it's well understood that even with full compliance, even with our permissible exposure limits, there will still be much more disease out there than there really needs to be. Even what we enforce is not really adequate to fully protect workers. Nevertheless, even those, unfortunately, the sad story is that even our standards are not very often, all too often, not well complied with. And I'm going to go through a few cases that we've been dealing with, that OSHA's been dealing, and not just this administration, but even the last administration over the last several years. And I read about this. I used to write about it. I used to do a blog, and I'd write about these situations, and I continuously shake my head with all that we know about asbestos these days over these many years, that we still have to enforce these cases. One of the worst was one that was fairly well known because of the lawsuits that came out of it, but it was a building in Houston that was owned by Mr. Eric Ho, who locked 11 untrained workers into a building so that they could remove asbestos while escaping detection. He might have gotten away with it, except that while they were locked in this building, a gas explosion occurred. And in the process, it was discovered not only that he was locking these workers in, which is illegal, but in fact that they were removing asbestos. These were non-English speaking, uneducated, undocumented immigrants. They were working in their street clothes, no respiratory protection, no training. He knew the law, he knew he was endangering lives, but he felt that somehow he was above it all. We ended up with actually originally a $1.5 million citation against him, which, for OSHA is a pretty big case. Normally we don't get anywhere close to that. Last year we found asbestos exposure violations in 83 inspections of general industry work sites, as well as 140 in construction work sites. Again, that's 80, 140, that's 220 too many as far as I'm concerned, and who knows how many we're not getting to. We only get there when we have a reason to get there. When somebody files a complaint or we have a referral by, ideally some building inspector who happens to be passing through and sees something that doesn't quite look kosher. But no one really knows how many of these cases are happening that we never get to. In November 2009, we inspected a warehouse in Buffalo where a contractor exposed workers to asbestos. 5 of the workers were young college students who were paid less than half the going rate for trained asbestos workers, cleaning up a basement of a building which had asbestos debris falling off the pipes, landing on the ground. They were just asked to basically wade through all that while they were cleaning up the basement. No training, no respirators, no protective clothing. Again, college students, and it was kind of ironic. I had just, a couple of weeks before this case was presented to us, traveled to my daughter's in college in Eckerd College in St. Petersburg, and she asked me to come in and speak to her political science class, which I did. And after the class, one of her friends came up to me and said, like last summer I was working in cleaning up a building and shoveling a bunch of stuff into plastic bags, and somebody told us it was asbestos. And I knew what asbestos was, so I immediately quit. But a number of the kids didn't quit. They kept on because it was pretty good pay. She said it took her a couple of weeks before she figured out what she had to do, and she did end up calling, I think she ended up calling EPA. Unfortunately, by that time, the job had ended. The person who had contracted with these kids was gone and had disappeared, and they never did catch up to them. And then again, I got back to work and found this other story where we had actually caught up to it. But again, that leaves the question with me: how much of this is really going on that we don't know about? We issued willful citations there because the employer had demonstrated intentional knowing, indifference, disregard for the law, plain indifference for workers' safety and health. We had a lot of evidence that the employer knew that this was asbestos and still had not protected his workers, and we were able to file a $500,000 citation against him. Now again, in September 2009, we inspected a hospital in Boston where we found workers removing asbestos panels from laboratory ventilation hoods. Again, they were exposed to asbestos. They did not have any training, any protective equipment. The employer was not monitoring the workplace for exposure. 19 violations of standards and a proposed penalty of $136,000. Another Blackstone investigation, this was a steel sheet metal plant in Buffalo where temporary workers again were hired to remove insulation containing asbestos. Same story, failure to provide safeguards, no respirators, no protective clothing, no training. Trash bags full of asbestos contaminated materials that were not labeled. Again, a number of serious and repeat violations in that case. Now, you're seeing a kind of a repeat story here of us finding some of these cases, going in, finding egregious circumstances, and citing the employer, penalizing them for anywhere between a couple of $100,000 in some cases to $1 million. But that's about it. And not only are there a number of cases we don't find, there are a number of cases that we do find where fines are even less than what I was talking about. Now, fines and penalties are not the only tool OSHA has at its disposal. We spend a lot of time doing education and training and promotion, compliance assistance, and that's all well and fine, but we do find penalties to be our most important tool. Not only to send a message to, obviously, the employer that has endangered workers, but to send messages to employers across the country. You may have heard several months ago we issued the biggest fine in OSHA's history, $87 million against BP for their failure to address a number of the hazards that led to an explosion in 2005 that cost the lives of 15 workers. We've cited BP in Toledo a few weeks later for $3 million for another refinery, similar hazards that they had not addressed. When Hilda Solis came into office, she announced that there was a new sheriff in town, and that was not just a slogan, she really means it. And so we will be using, to the extent of our ability, these penalties. Unfortunately, OSHA penalties are far too low. Our maximum for a serious violation is only $7,000. And the average, once you provide the discounts for size or good behavior, whatever, ends up being closer to $1,000. We're allowed to issue a $70,000 penalty for a willful citation, but willful citations, the way the law is written, are often difficult to prove. And even for a large company, $70,000 isn't much. For a very large company like BP, even $22 million, which was their original citation, or even $87 million is not a lot for a huge company like that. And in fact, we find, especially when we're going up against large companies, that even our maximum penalties, even when we have egregious penalties where we can multiply the individual penalties, really don't have any kind of financial impact on the employer. We are looking at our own penalty structure, and we're going to try to at least increase our penalties, our average penalties, relatively significantly, but we're still not talking about much. Again, our average penalty for a serious citation is only $1,000, and we're trying to, if we can increase that, even tripling that only comes to a few $1,000s still for an average penalty. Now, I mentioned before the Protecting America's Workers Act, which is in Congress right now. That would do a number of things. One of the major things is increase penalties and also enhance our ability to go after employers for criminal prosecutions. Right now, we can only prosecute an employer under the criminal statutes if there's a willful citation that leads to the death of a worker. And even then, it's only a misdemeanor. What that means is that, generally the Justice Department, isn't real anxious to spend a whole lot of resources, understandably, going after something that's only going to end up as a misdemeanor. And that's compared to almost every other law, whether it's, laws dealing with transporting illegally killed deer across state lines, harassing harassing burros on federal land, violating the national tuna statutes. There are a number of of laws that provide much higher criminal penalties than the Occupational Safety and Health Act, that essentially than for killing a worker after the willful violation of an OSHA standard. Now, as I said, this is a willful citation after a worker dies in an incident. We have no ability to go after criminally after an employer, very little ability to go after criminally after an employer for exposing a worker to asbestos, which may not kill the worker, which won't kill the worker today or tomorrow, but may very well kill the worker in 10, 20, or 30 years. EPA can do that. We can't under the Occupational Safety and Health Act. Again, the bill in Congress, Protecting America's Workers Act, would fix a lot of that, would make criminal penalties a felony instead of a misdemeanor. We could go after employers not just for killing workers, but for seriously injuring them, including their health. So we would be able to address a lot of the issues that we can't address now. It would also actually raise our penalties, not to where they probably should be. Last time our penalties were set were 1990, and this would essentially raise them to what they would have been had they actually increased with inflation. Again, we're not trying, just to punish employers. We are trying to motivate employers to do the right thing. We are trying to motivate employers not to cut corners. We're in a very difficult time in our economy right now. A lot of bottom lines are suffering, and what happens then is the first thing to go is health and safety protections, training, equipment maintenance, the kind of things that directly or indirectly lead to a safe workplace, or if they're neglected, into an unsafe workplace. Now, what else are we doing? And around asbestos, we are working with NIOSH to further the science around asbestos. Some of the issues, as you know, that have come up about which kind of asbestos is more dangerous than other kinds of asbestos. There's more research that needs to be done, certainly, and we certainly are working with NIOSH to do that. One of the most important things we're doing, though, is we're working with some of the companies that are developing alternatives to asbestos. We are very concerned about alternatives to a number of chemicals or substances like asbestos. Right now, for example, as you probably are aware, we've been dealing, well, unfortunately OSHA hasn't been dealing, but now we are trying to deal with a chemical called diacetyl, which was a component in butter flavoring and popcorn, and led to just devastating health effects on workers' lungs. Diacetyl, I mean, to their credit, I don't know if it's to their credit, it's because of lawsuits from people like you who have been affected by this. They have stopped using pretty much diacetyl certainly in popcorn and in a lot of other foods, and they've switched to other chemicals, butter flavoring chemicals. Now, some of the initial science we've seen from NIOSH shows that these alternative chemicals are just as bad, if not worse, than diacetyl was. So it asks, you know, we're really asking ourselves the question, why are we spending an enormous amount of resources regulating diacetyl when they're just going to switch to something that's just as bad? It's kind of, we call it regulatory whack-a-mole. And the same thing with asbestos. So we are working very closely with there's a coalition of manufacturers of asbestos alternatives, and working with them and with the University of Cincinnati to not only to study the effects, possible health effects of some of these alternatives, but in the meantime, before we have the results of that, also working with them to ensure that exposure to workers is at a minimum. Now, you know, it's always difficult. The state of science in this country is not where it should be, especially when it comes to worker health and safety, or even consumer health and safety. We still have a lot of problems, even when companies discover certain information, of getting that information made public. This is not just a workplace safety issue or workplace chemical issue. This is an overall chemical issue, and there are efforts now going on in Congress to try to update the Toxic Substances Control Act. We're looking at that and seeing if we can basically be part of that as well. There doesn't seem to be much point in just addressing chemicals in two different ways, chemicals for workers and chemicals for everybody else. We need to address them all as a whole. As you know, OSHA, you know, we have done a lot of work on asbestos over the years, but OSHA really only regulates about 500 chemicals in the workplace. Most of those are based on science coming from the 1950s and 1960s. I mean, it's a joke. And yet it takes us years and sometimes decades to issue even one new standard because of all of the burdens through the law, through the courts, through additional laws that Congress has added, through other requirements that we have, makes our regulatory process, well, much more than slow, almost deadly slow in some cases, especially when it comes to chemicals. We are looking at the whole green green technology, green economy movement. We, of course, are very supportive of that, not only for the job creation, but for also the beneficial effects that'll have on our environment. On the other hand, as we all know, when you go to renovate a building, when you go to weatherize a building, depending on the age of the building, you are very likely to come across asbestos, not to speak of lead and other hazards. Now, we have been accused of kind of being the Debbie Downer of the green movement here, because we keep coming up and saying when we see green energy, green economy, we see asbestos, we see lead, we see a number of other hazards. Although listening to some of the speakers this morning, I think we have a lot of Debbie Downers here when it comes to, again, addressing a lot of these issues. There are so many products now that still contain asbestos, not to speak of other hazardous substances as well. But we are working with NIOSH on these issues. We're working with the building trades unions on these issues, a number of other unions and associations, and trying to make sure that green jobs are in fact safe jobs, because green jobs aren't really good jobs or safe jobs if they're hurting workers or hurting consumers. Finally, I want to thank you all for the support that you've given OSHA, that you've given the public health movement in this country. As I've said at the beginning, it's difficult in Washington. I found it surprisingly, in a way, surprisingly easy to run an agency. We have some very good managers at OSHA. The place just churns forward, not quite by itself, but it does churn forward. People know what they're doing. And I have a lot of admiration, I should say, also for the employees of OSHA. These are almost all totally dedicated individuals. They came to OSHA for a purpose. It wasn't like they were riding down the street one day and said, oh, I think I'll work there. They came because they're concerned about workplace health and safety, and they want to do their best. And really, all we had to do when we came out there was unleash their potential, and people are going off and doing what they came to OSHA to do, and for that we thank them. But as I said, agencies, they will move forward. It doesn't take that much energy to run the agency. Well, it does take a lot, actually, to run the agency, but nothing compared to what it takes to change the agency. And there are a lot of changes we need to make in that agency. This agency, a lot of the people there are very used to talking to corporate health and safety professionals, which is fine. We need to be talking to corporate health and safety professionals. But most of all, we need to be talking to workers. And that we seem to have lost that ability over the last 8 years, and so we're trying to get that back, trying to get people in there that actually know how to talk to workers, know what happens in workplaces, know and understand that OSHA doesn't work unless workers are involved, and workers will not get involved in occupational safety and health unless they feel relatively secure and safe in exercising their health and safety rights. They have to know their rights, they have to exercise those rights, and it's not always easy. In fact, it's very difficult sometimes, especially in this economy, in this society where we have such a low unionization rates, and workers don't feel they have the protections that they need to exercise their rights, to exercise their right to complain to their employer about health and unsafe conditions or to call OSHA. We have a conference next week, I think somebody mentioned this, for Latino workers in Texas, and what we are trying to do there is not only make sure that workers are educated about their rights and about the hazards they face in the workplace, but because many immigrant workers are afraid of government for good reason, afraid to come to OSHA, not for good reason, but they certainly have understandable suspicions and fears, and sometimes, obviously, or very often, these fears are very true in terms of being retaliated against in their workplace. We're also bringing in not just workers, we're bringing in a number of community organizations that deal with Latino workers, churches, day labor groups, who are very good at working around wage and hour issues, but don't know a whole lot about health and safety issues. So we're trying to bring all of them in there, educate them about OSHA, what OSHA does. We're bringing in a lot of OSHA personnel as well, because we need more people that know how to work with immigrant workers. We need to hire more people from that community, actually, and Secretary Solis has challenged us to do that. But we need to bring people in that know how to work not just with workers, not just with OSHA, but with, again, these day labor groups, with churches. And we need to build a community where everyone will work toward the same goal of ensuring that workplaces are safe. But again, nothing happens in Washington, nothing very good happens in Washington just because people like me are in there complaining and whining all the time about all we need to be doing. Good things only happen in Washington because of people like you who come and talk to their congresspeople, who come and talk to their senators, who come and talk to us about what we need to be doing. I think we are doing some good things there. We're certainly trying to do a lot of good things there, and I think as you look at our record, hopefully you'll be happy. But even if you're happy, don't be satisfied. Keep on us. Keep making sure we're doing the right thing. Keep talking to us. Thank you.